Welcome, everybody. This is the first of a three-part series called Profiles in Pesak. Next week, we'll be hearing from Dr. Richard Hidri about Rabbi Uziel, and the following week from Rabbi Eli Fisher about the Hazon Sofer or Hatam Sofer, depending how you like to pronounce that. The idea of this series is that we're focusing on three. We could have chosen others, and maybe in the future we will. Three figures who have been extremely influential in their time and down to contemporary times in a variety of Jewish communities. And I felt that in some of these cases, we know just a little bit about these people, or we know almost a caricature about these individuals. And we don't really necessarily know what was driving them, what their methodology was, what their core concerns were, and how it came to be that they were so influential in the communities in which they continue to be influential to today. So because of that, we're convening this series to learn a bit more about them. And I'm delighted today to introduce our speaker for this afternoon or evening, depending where you're joining from, or morning if you're in California, Dr. Benjamin Brown. And I'll just give a very brief introduction at his request, so we have a lot of time to learn together today. Professor Brown is a professor of Jewish thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His main focus is on Orthodox Judaism, and in particular, Halakhah, Chassidut, Musar, and the Hashkafa of Haredi communities. Among his books are the Hazon Ish. Dr. Brown's book on the Hazon Ish is over 1,000 Hebrew pages. I don't know if it's been translated into English yet, but I assume it would be much longer in English. A book about the Lithuanian Musar movement, about the Haredim, a guide to their beliefs and sectors, and like a ship on a stormy sea, the story of Karlin Hasidism. So Dr. Brown, without further ado, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I'm glad to be here. As the title suggests, the main topic of this lecture will be the Hazon Ish's method of Pesak, but some biographical introduction is necessary, I believe. So I'll just say a few words about his life. The Hazon Ish was born in 1878 in Belarus. What today is considered Belarus. In the Jewish geography, it's often considered as part of Lithuania. And for the most of his life, he spent studying Torah alone. Actually, he got married in quite a late time in his life. His marriage was unsuccessful. He didn't take any rabbinic post. He didn't study in a yeshiva. He didn't study, almost never studied with other people. They had some chavrusas, but not something permanent. And most of the time, he just sat and wrote his chidushim, wrote his chidushei Torah, his halachic discussions. And in the entire period of his life in Lithuania, after the war, he and his wife moved to Vilna, to a suburb of Vilna. And in his entire life, until his immigration to Eretz Israel, he wrote only 4 books that were barely read by Talmidei Chachamim and Torah scholars. For the main reason, the main reason of which is that he actually discussed the Talmudic text analyzed the Talmudic text in a very unfashionable way. While in most of the Litvish yeshivas of his time, the method was the Brisker method and its ramifications, he studied the Gemara just as the medieval scholars, medieval rabbis used to discuss, very much attached to the pshat, not shunning from analytic and conceptual abstractions, doing it very text-oriented and with a kind of large scale perspective on the text itself rather than the depth of its concepts. And he sat in Vilna and in a very small apartment which he shared with his wife, and also one room or half a room of which was her business, allotted for her business. And this is how he was supposed to remain for the rest of his life. until something happened. Actually, he wanted to come to Eretz Israel already in 1924, but his friend that had already made the Aliyah wrote to him that he won't have any source of livelihood because his wife's business was she was a dealer of how do you say call that Arigim. Anyway, her business had no demand in Eretz Israel, so so they didn't have any source of livelihood. So she stayed there until one night in 1933, thieves broke into their shop and stole all the merchandise, and they remained without any livelihood in Vilna, in Vilnius either. So he said to himself, if we don't have anything to live from, neither here nor in Eretz Israel, so better do it in Eretz Israel. And they decided to move. He came in the summer of 1933 without anyone knowing him, almost anyone knowing him here. But the most important rabbi of Vilna wrote to Rav Kook here in Eretz Israel, telling him that the very very important scholar, Talmudic scholar, is coming, and if he can, it'd be nice if he helps him by buying his books. And this is what Rabbi Kook tried to do. And this was the main source of their living in the first years here in Eretz Israel. They lived they were in very in shortage in terms of money and livelihood. But he kept writing his books. And here, if in the 55 years of his life in Lithuania, he wrote only 4 books, here it came out that he wrote almost 1 book per year, which means that in the 20 years of his stay in Eretz Israel, he wrote about 20 books, more or less. all of them chidushim on the Talmud. He didn't want to go to Jerusalem, even though he could be much more prominent there. He rather wanted to be in the new Yishuv, where there are much less religious struggles and things that can distract him. He just wanted to keep sitting and writing his chidushim. So he chose Bnei Brak, which then, if we know Bnei Brak today as, a kind of capital of the Haredi world, then it wasn't like that at all. Actually, his choice of living in Bnei Brak is one of the reasons that made Bnei Brak such an important center. And he chose Bnei Brak when it was a very young colony. It was founded less than 10 years before his coming, and he said it's a Makom Torah, it's a place of Torah, because there was one yeshiva there, but most of the population of Bnei Brak was not Haredi, was mostly religious Zionist at that time, and he didn't think much would change, but much did change because his books became more and more dominant, and Rav Kook tried to make them better known. But he was involved, more than that, he was involved in disputes, Halachic disputes of the time, which attracted attention to him. Now, if he came in 1933 and Rav Kook passed away in 1935, so Rav Kook really cared for him only for a very short time. And the rest was a kind of a gradual ascent of the Hazon Ish to the status of a very prominent rabbi of the period, and then in the first years still in Bnei Brak. Since 1941, and I'll say in a minute what happened in 1941. In 1941, sorry, he became a first league, I would say, rabbi, and since 1948, he became, I would say, Gdol Ador, the main rabbinic personality of the generation, the main Torah authority. Now, what happened in 1941 is that the Hazon Ish took a very outstanding and unpopular, I would say even, position on a halachic question that was quite burning at the time, which is the question of the dateline. I would refer to that in a minute. Because he was so his position was so unusual, rabbis disputed with him. And if they disputed with him, they said, who is that rabbi from Bnei Brak who with such self-confidence and assertively stands against most of the rabbis of Eretz Israel and the diaspora? And he became more and more involved in halachic disputes that made him more famous. In 1948, there was another psak that actually then it was the dispute on the women's military service and then national service in the young state of Israel, in which really took the main position. They became the main fighter against what he called the evil decree, the gzeira of the government. And thanks to this involvement, he became even better known. And alongside the Briskerov, Yitzhak Zev Soloveitchik, but he even more became the most influential leaders on Haredi politics as well. And that's why Ben-Gurion wanted to meet with either of them in 1952. Eventually, he didn't meet with Briskerov. He met only with the Hazon Ish, a historic meeting that even eternalized the myth of the Hazon Ish even more. Even Ben-Gurion himself later wrote to him, I won't argue with you on Halakhah because I know you are Gdol Ador, the greatest Torah authority of the generation. He passed away in 1953 at the age of 75 from a heart attack in Bnei Brak in Leil Shabbat on Friday night. And the more time passed, the more his figure became, I would say, a myth in the Haredi society. Today, even Hasidim to a great extent take him as the founder of the yeshiva world in Eretz Israel. He was not the founder. He was certainly not the only founder, but the leader of the generation in these critical years of the foundation of the state of Israel. And they take him as a kind of tzaddik, not only as a halachic leader, but a halachic authority, but also a kind of spiritual leader of the entire Haredi community of Eretz Israel. So that's about his wife, by the way, that was much older than him, passed away a few years after him. So she survived him and lived even more than him, much more than him, actually. He didn't have any children, so he didn't have any heirs, but he had more than one brothers-in-law, from whom he had nephews, of course, sisters and brothers-in-law, from whom he had nephews, and he fostered those nephews. Some of them are really important figures, became important figures. His brother-in-law, the Steiper, became a prominent leader after his passing. His nephew, Chaim Kanievsky, is the prominent leader of the Litvish sector today. And the Greiniman family as well, also very important rabbis, quite, I would say, controversial rabbis in the Haredi community of more recent decades. So this is about biography. Any questions so far? Do you want to ask something about biography?
You mentioned his wife, that she was older. He predeceased her, but it was an unsuccessful marriage. What do we have to say to that? What kind of evidence do we learn about that?
Yes,
They didn't divorce.
No, actually, he discovered that she's much older than him only short before the wedding. So his parents really exerted pressure that they cancel the marriage, the wedding, but he refused. He didn't want to cause disgrace to a Jewish daughter, so a Jewish woman, and so he married her. And she had, on one hand, she did make sure that he sits and study. And that was the most important thing for him, but she was of a very different temper than his, very talkative and sometimes really even verbally violent, I would say, to some degree, very rough person. Later on, she also, actually, she probably was a little less stable, not really mentally ill, but less stable in the mental in mental terms, and he wanted to divorce her, and probably, according to at least one testimony, he suggested divorce, and they didn't have children, so he had a halachic reason as well, and he did want children, he loved children. So he suggested her to divorce after 10 years of marriage, according to the Halakhah, and she refused. She even, in that testimony, she even threatened that she would commit suicide. So he gave up and actually lived with her without much harmony for the rest of their lives.
Do we know her name?
Yes, true, Basha.
Basha.
Basha, Batya in Hebrew.
And like these testimonies, these accounts, these are firsthand accounts of people who met her, who knew her?
Yes, it's a relative of hers. It's Chaim Kulitz, the author. Mm-hmm. Okay, so now to the main question, his halachic rulings. Now, as I said, the Hazon Ish used to write like the Rishonim, like the medieval scholars, medieval Talmudists, which didn't only mean that he didn't go to, first of all, it means that he didn't go to conceptual abstractions, as I said, but it's not only that. When he wrote a halachic discussion, when he wrote a halachic discourse, a chidush, he wrote it as if he is about to write a psak. I mean, even when there wasn't a halachic question facing him, he treated it, his methodology was that to treat any Talmudic question, any halachic question standing before him, not as a theoretical one, but as an actual one, as something, a practical question to be solved. This is already quite different from the method of most of the Achronim, of most of the modern era scholars. And therefore, his chidushim are often taken as sources of psak, and people, rabbis decide, give rulings, halachic rulings according to them. Not only that, but his talmidim, his disciples, follows those halachic rulings as, their halachic path, and even his not unwritten halachic conduct, which is taken as anagot Hazon Ish, they became a kind of code for the circle known in Bnei Brak as the Hazon Ishnikim, as the followers of the Hazon Ish. So it really became much more than just Talmudic discussions. It's a kind of a discussion for bottom line conclusions, and he took that very seriously. But beyond and above that, he also really wrote things for and regarding practical questions that stood on his table in order to be resolved. Now, as I said, when he was still in Lithuania, he wasn't much involved in public affairs. But when he came to Eretz Israel, he became more involved first in Bnei Brak, then later in much more countrywide and even worldwide questions, halachic questions. One of the first questions he coped with was the question of the Shemitah, of the sabbatical year, and especially the Heter HaMechira, the permission to sell, as often attributed to Rav Kook, to Rabbi Kook, but it's not his, as was developed in the modern era. What actually happened there, I guess most of you know about that, but the new Jewish colonies that were founded by Zionists, the Zionist first by the Chovei Zion in 1882, and then later the later Aliyot, had a serious problem with the sabbatical year, with the Shemitah. They were quite young settlements, based on agriculture, and stopping the work for a whole year was actually kind of, gave them no chance to survive. Left them no chance to survive. They not only they had to cultivate the land for themselves, but also they had commitments. For example, some of their commitments were to send wine to France, to the Baron Rothschild, because he wanted that his colonies will also supply wine to the Jews of France. But not only that, they really had problems with really they can't sell the agricultural products, and they didn't have what to do. They couldn't live from anything, actually. That was their only source of living. So three rabbis from Lithuania found this solution of really selling the land to an Arab, to a non-Jew, and by that, and the Jews of the agricultural settlements would work there as kind of workers hired by the Arab or by anyone else, not on their own land, and that is allowed. And in such a kind of a legal fiction, also the fruit and the vegetables will not be considered as sanctified by the holiness of the seventh year of the sabbatical year, and therefore you can sell them, you can export them, you can do anything like ordinary fruit and vegetables. Rav Kook was the one who really founded this psak much more systematically. First of all, he wrote the most extensive discussion about it in his introduction to Shabbat Haaretz, to his main book about the sabbatical year. A book, is always something that has more greater effect, greater impact in the halachic library. But not only that, he became a chief rabbi, and once in 7 years, he made it automatically, until recently it was done by the chief rabbinate, a kind of procedure of selling all the lands of Eretz Israel to an Arab, in this way exempting them from the duties of Shemitah. Now, when the Hazon Ish came here, he wasn't satisfied with this arrangement. Most of the Jews in that time, the vast majority of the Jews, the Orthodox Jews of that time, accepted this solution. There was no other choice, and Rabbi Kook's authority was accepted by most of the Torah-abiding Jews, so they accepted it. But the Hazon Ish was very dissatisfied with it. Now, the Hazon Ish on the whole didn't like halachic bypasses. This is not my phrasing. It's when I worked on my thesis, I met with the very interesting Jew who was a Talmud of the Hazon Ish, a disciple of the Hazon Ish, studied with him, Professor Tzvi Yehuda, and he passed away a few years ago. And he told me that he really characterized the Hazon Ish by that. He said it's not only that he didn't like halachic bypasses, but also the bypasses that did exist, he accepted them because they were part of the Halakhah. But he said if it was up to the Hazon Ish in the Middle Ages, suppose he lived in the Middle Ages, he wouldn't acknowledge all the other bypasses as well, such as the Eteriska, and selling the business to a goy for Shabbat and things like that, goy shel Shabbat, all those legal fictions, he didn't like them. He didn't like things like that. And he didn't like also the heter mechira, the permission to sell. And in contrast to that, he wrote his halachic rulings regarding Shvit, where he tried to be as lenient as he can regarding the scope and the content of the prohibitions of Shemitah, but not by any means didn't allow an overall exemption from all of them. He tried to be lenient on the particular level, but he completely negated an overall exemption of the entire mitzvah of Shemitah. Now, he had a few criticisms against the heter mechira, and he summarized them, not all of them. He said that, yes, there are three main problems in heter mechira. It's not his analysis, but to summarize it. First of all, is that he says it doesn't really, it doesn't work. It's void. It doesn't. The sale is void because it's fictitious, and not only fictitious, but also it's in prohibition, because there is a prohibition to sell the lands of Eretz Israel to a non-Jew. So first of all, it's prohibited. Second, once it's done, it's fictitious, so it doesn't work. So it doesn't really do it doesn't bring the effect that you want to have. And third, that it doesn't even if it's done, it doesn't neutralize, or it doesn't negate the sanctity of Shemitah from the fruits and vegetables, and therefore it involves other prohibitions as well. So he summarizes his opinion quite, not all of it, but quite succinctly in a letter from 1952, where he writes, and I read the English translation: the sale of the entire land to an Arab, this is source number 1 in your handouts, the sale of the entire land to an Arab is null and void, and is incomparable to the sale of chametz. Some other halachic authorities said we do the same thing with chametz. We do the same thing with other problems in which we solve the halachic problem by selling the object to a non-Jew. He said it's incomparable. Those fruits and vegetables that were picked during the sabbatical year are exempt from tithe. Exempt from tithe, masot, means that they still have the sanctity of fruit, because they can only be exempt from tithe when they have the sanctity of fruit, even if they're sold, for 3 reasons. A, because they were sold by an agent, shaliach, and there is no agency for transgression. If you send an agent to commit a transgression, the agency is void. So if the chief rabbinate takes this agency, it's void and nothing is done. Because it was not given, it was not given to be in the tabu. The tabu is in the Turkish, and then even today it's called the tabu in Israel. It's the land registry office. If you don't register a land in the tabu, it's legally invalid. So, and if the Arab would sue to uphold the sale, they would say to him, those who sold the land, this is your law. Without having registered the land in the tabu, one doesn't acquire it. So it's all fictitious when it's not legally binding. C, because in everyone's heart they know that this is not a true acquisition. Whereas regarding the sale of chametz, we say that in order that one not violate bal yara'eh, yes, the prohibition that the chametz will be held in Passover, one has sufficient intent to sell. Here one does not have such a presumed intent to sell, to send the land to a Gentile in order that the land lose its sanctity on the sabbatical year. To the contrary, we all prefer to keep the sabbatical year rather than sell the entire land to a Gentile. So, in other words, you say in the chametz, it's an object of avera, of transgression. So we would like to get rid of it. But here, when it's the land of Israel, it's a holy land, we want to sanctify it. It's an object of mitzvah. We love the land of Israel. We don't want to get rid of it. So in his eyes, it's all fictitious. And he started this dispute in the Shnat Shmitah, the sabbatical year of 1937, and he went according to his, he publicized his own rulings, which were contrary to Rav Kook, the previous chief rabbi, and he was involved in debates with rabbis who followed Rav Kook's halachic shita, halachic ruling. He didn't deter from that. But still, most of his actions on that issue was in Bnei Brak, and Bnei Brak was still, an agricultural colony. Some parts of it, at least, were agricultural. So his voice was not much heard in other parts of the issue. But as I said, he was also involved in other agricultural questions, such as milking on Shabbat. He was against that as well. But in that, by the way, he was even a little more lenient than Rav Kook. Rav Kook was absolutely against milking on Shabbat, even in some other ways, trying to change the ordinary method. He was against that anyway. Hazon Ish did allow to do it in some strange way of, if you milk the cow, but you don't use the milk itself, but leave it to waste, that's okay. Only if you use it, it's problematic. That's what he said. So at least you can have the cow, relieve the cow from the pains of having the milk during the entire day. That could help. But not use the milk itself. And then other few questions that were raised by the agricultural, by the farmers of that time. But the main change in his status, in his public position, was the question of the dateline that was in 1941. A few hundreds of yeshiva bocharim managed to escape Lithuania from the Nazi occupation in 1941. It was initially, most of you know it as the escape of the Mir yeshiva. Most of them were from Mir, that's true, but there are also students of other yeshivot and other Torah scholars, Torah Talmudic important rabbis that escaped with that group. And they first, they managed to flee thanks to the initiative of a few Jewish activists. Most important of them is Zerach Varhaftig, but mostly thanks to the help of the Japanese consul in Vilnius, Mr. Sujihara, a real hero that helped them with the fake passports. And so their first stop was Japan, and they settled in Japan, an ally of the Nazis, but Japan hosted them until they moved to China, which was safer. And they settled. Their first stop was at the Japanese city of Kobe. And now here they had to face the question of when to celebrate the Shabbat and the Chagim. Because there was a halachic problem of the dateline. As you know, the international dateline passes in the international dateline is a convention only from 19th century. The international dateline passes in the Pacific, and since because of that, if you passed the international dateline, you started counting Sunday, Monday, etc. from that dateline and on. But there was a question: where does the halachic dateline passes? Because according to some opinions, the halachic dateline passes in China, which means that if you are in Japan, eastern to China, you still have to count the days not according to Asia, but according to America. It's as if you didn't cross the Pacific. Japan still belongs to America, and only from some line in the area of Shanghai and on, you start the new days, you start counting the days anew. And when it came to the question of Shabbat, they tried to keep 2 days, lechumra, to be on the safe side. But it was more critical when it came to Yom Kippur. They can't fast 2 days, it's dangerous. So the yeshiva bocharim and their rabbis sent letters to rabbis of Eastern Europe and to rabbis of Eretz Israel. When should we celebrate the Shabbat? According to one of the opinions, Yom Kippur, when should we celebrate, Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur should be on Wednesday. And according to the other opinion, it ought to be on Thursday. Which means if you take the opinion that that Japan is like most of the Pacific and like America is backward one day, you have to keep it on Wednesday. And if you think that Japan is a part of Asia in halachic terms, you have to keep it on Thursday. And this is a quite complex halachic question. Not many rabbis dealt with that before. So not many rabbis dealt with that before. And they sent the question to rabbis of Eastern Europe, as I said, in Eretz Israel, and they made it in Eretz Israel. Rabbi Herzog convened a few rabbis to decide this question in Tzom Gedalia, a week before Yom Kippur, and they decided, according to the opinion of most of the Rishonim, or most of the medieval rabbis, that Japan is a part of Asia, and therefore that Yom Kippur should be kept on Wednesday. The Hazon Ish was also invited to this convention, but the Hazon Ish hated conventions, hated the mass discussions. He always felt that it doesn't really bring you closer to truth, but rather the opposite. So he wrote a telegram of his own to the yeshiva students while the convention was just about to send their telegram to Kobe. He wrote his telegram a few minutes before that, saying, and I quote, text number 2, "Beloved brothers, eat on Wednesday and fast for Yom Kippur on Thursday, and do not worry about anything." Do not worry about anything, meaning in this context, do not worry about, do not pay too much attention to what the other rabbis tell you. I'm telling you the truth. And this is, I think, quite, I would say, almost insolent in such a case. 23 rabbis convene together and have one opinion and are just about sending them the telegram, and he just takes the initiative and sends them the opposite opinion and say it very decisively, and expresses it very decisively. It's quite, I mean, exceptional in the rabbinic culture. But he did that, and he was quite bold in doing so. And some of he managed to infuriate some of the rabbis there, and at least one of them, Rabbi Tikochinsky, wrote an entire booklet to argue with him on this question. And the argument continued in the years later. Even today, the debate is still on in the rabbinic world, but eventually the Bochurim there in Japan, most of them accepted the majority's ruling. A minority, nobody heard about what Hazon Ish there, but they were convinced by his halachic arguments and kept the Hazon Ish's ruling. And a very, very small minority, including probably Rabban Kotler, according to some of the hearsays, kept 2 days and fasted for 2 days Yom Kippur, which is quite, I mean, unpleasant, to say the least of it. But the Hazon Ish's name became much more familiar, and people knew that there is some very important Talmid Chochem that has original opinions sometimes there in Bnei Brak, which should be consulted on halachic questions. When the Hazon Ish was involved in the disputes about this question of halachic dateline, he had to cope with the other opinions that accepted the notion that the halachic dateline puts Japan within the dateline, within Asia, as a part of Asia. He not only disregarded this opinion because of its actually there's a textual difficulty there, because according to the Rishonim, there are two criteria which they believe bring to one and the same conclusion. One of them is that Eretz Israel should be right in the middle between the end of the East and the end of the West. And the end of the East is where the dateline starts. Now, we know that it doesn't happen like that. I mean, Eretz Israel is not right in the middle between the end of Asia and the eastern shore of Asia and the western shore of Africa or Europe. So you have to really cope with the texts here, and the Hazon Ish has his own idea about that. But the other rabbis who said that dateline does include Japan as part of Asia, he considered that he disregarded this opinion not only because he thought it's wrong textually. He also believed that those rabbis who adopted that opinion did so because they wanted to suit the halachic dateline to the international dateline, which is, according to his opinion, unacceptable. The international dateline, a Gentile convention from the 19th century, should not play any role, any function with the halachic discussion, because in the halachic discussion there was already a dateline from the 6 days of creation. Since there is Shabbat, there should be an answer to the question whether in what date, in what day of the week Shabbat falls in Japan. So he wrote a letter to Rabbi Tikochinsky saying that the notion of 12 hours to this direction and 12 hours to the other one is not axiomatic. As I said, 12 hours meaning that Eretz Israel is in the middle, and is not common among the Rishonim of blessed memory. Rather, it is only a convention among the scholars of the outside world, Gentile scientists. Therefore, there is no room to enforce that convention on the text of the Rishonim of blessed memory and to divert them to foreign purposes. Foreign purposes meaning to be like the rest of the world, in order to have it comply with a secular convention. Anyone will see that this never dawned on them in any of these matters, and no one ever disagreed with Rabbi Zrachi Halevi, his main source in that question, on the question of the start of the day. Only the non-Talmudic seculars emitted a foreign spirit into the Jewish people on this issue. So it's very staunch about this. Yes, the halachic question should be taken out of any non-halachic considerations, non-textual considerations. It should be purely halachic without interfering, without letting any non-halachic or political, cultural, other questions, other considerations interfere in the halachic discretion. Another important dispute in which the Hazon Ish took part and was became very famous of, and even today, is the question of halachic measurements, the shiurim. In the Talmud, in ancient measurements, for example, tefach, etzba, which is something like inch, bet kur, all kinds of ancient measurements that today, do no longer prevail. So the question came up, how do you translate the ancient measurements into modern measurements? If I go to buy a lulav or a hadas, and hadas should be of 3 tefachim, how much is a tefach? How do I translate it to centimeters? I will measure it in centimeters in Israel. How should I translate the tefach to centimeters? The Hazon Ish, this question actually bothered the halachic scholars already from the Middle Ages, and was reawaked by the Nodab Yehuda in the 18th century. And the Hazon Ish, once again, had to cope with it when it came to Eretz Yisrael. In Eretz Yisrael, they had their own tradition based on the Rambam, on Maimonides, and the Hazon Ish was quite dissatisfied with this tradition. He said it's not really a reliable tradition, but more than that, he said, it's not a question that tradition should be involved in. We don't have to keep the measurements of older times. Measurements should be made according to each generation, and in particular, the Gdolim, the main halachic authorities of each generation. Therefore, if Rambam had his own measurements, his own translation to the Talmudic measurements, it doesn't apply to us. The Nodab Yehuda, which is closer to our period, Cheskelando, he's the one who should be the source for our times, and therefore the Hazon Ish's measurements are much larger than the ones that were accepted in Yerushalayim. For example, the most basic measurement that the Hazon Ish started from was that of etzba. Etzba is something like inch. In Jerusalem, they took the etzba for 2 centimeters. The Hazon Ish decided that it has to be 2.5 centimeters. But if the etzba is 2.5 centimeters, then the tefach is about 10 centimeters, and the ama is about 56 centimeters, etc., etc. It grows. It takes all the other measurements that depend on each other, makes them larger and larger. And the same goes later to the mikveh. How much water should be poured into the mikveh according to those measurements. Everything grows more and more, and the Hazon Ish went with that. People came to him and said, they have another minhag, another custom. As I said, they haven't had their tradition. So even if there is a dispute on the text, and it's not really a matter of and understanding you can't really it's not a matter of textual analysis. It's a matter of how to translate those measurements. What basis do you take for that? It's not a textual problem. So why not go to the minhag? Why not go to the custom? The Hazon Ish expressed his very clear opinion about customs, and here it's not just a halachic opinion. It's even, I would say, an ideological opinion, almost theological opinion. Minhag is only a source of halacha if it is constituted by the rabbis. The people, if we translate what the Hazon Ish says, and I'll read the text in a minute, what he actually says is that the halacha is is, or the Torah on the whole, is taken from the books. And those who interpret the books are the rabbis. The Halakhah is determined in the Beis Medrash, in Batei Midrash, not in the street, not in the homes. In the home, yes, there are other things that work, and it's not a pure halachic opinion. The real masters, so to speak, of the Halakhah are the rabbis or the Talmidei Chachamim, not the masses, not the people from the street. And he expresses it in a very clear, principled way when he wants to cope with the minhag. And he says, the main principle of minhag, the binding custom, yes, to which we attach a determinative weight in deciding that the communal practice ensures the truth and the proper conduct, being assisted by the merit of the community and the merits of their forefathers, which prevents them from failing and stumbling into mistakes, is limited to the practice of the community based on the ruling of a halachic authority who is appointed over the community. For it is the community's obligation to follow the rabbi that they appointed over themselves, and the communal practice manifests the ruling. Communal practice is only a source of evidence of what the rabbi said. However, the practice of the spiritually impoverished, dalat ha'am is the Hebrew term, who are not punctilious with their words and their interactions and with the precise details of the commandments, and their actions are all merely by rote, does not constitute a minhag to be taken as determinative, and as such a practice neither overrides a law nor establishes one. So minhag for him is, I would say, an inferior source of halacha. Minhag in the pure and simple sense, plain sense of the word of something popular is not a source of halacha. It's a source of halacha only as evidence to what the rabbis ruled, which is an important position as well. It's a part of the Hazon Ish theology, that the wisdom of the Torah is a supernatural wisdom. And you can only internalize this wisdom if you understand not only the text of the Torah, if you learn a lot of Torah, of the Talmud, yes, you don't only internalize the texts of the Torah, but also the spirit of the Torah. And rabbis can really understand things in what he calls often tvi'at eina deliba, the eye grip of the heart, which really catches the meaning. It's a kind of textual intuition that takes the meaning of the Torah or catches the meaning of the Torah even when the text is silent or not clear enough. And he took that to extremes. In that case, yes, the rabbis are those who really understand the Torah, and the people is not something to be taken in consideration. The people are those who have to obey the rabbis, not constitute, not enact the halacha. When we see what he wrote about the spiritual impoverished, this is not about the non-observant. This is about observant Jews who are not Talmidei Chachamim. But one of the most revolutionary rulings of the Hazon Ish relate to the non-observant Jews, which is a problem, of course, in the modern era for all rabbis. Here, it's the question is how do you really, what's the category used to describe the status of the non-observant Jews? According to Mechalelei Shabbat, desecrators of the Sabbath in public, according to Talmudic law, should be taken as non-Jews, which is impossible halachically, impossible socially. On the other hand, if you recognize them, if you acknowledge them as good Jews, you actually commit suicide. I mean, the Halakhah commits suicide, and no legal system can legitimize those who disobey it. No legal system whatsoever. The Halakhah is no different. So, in fact, the rabbis found a very good kind of solution that comes from Maimonides and goes back to a Talmudic sugya, Talmudic discussion, saying that if you are brought up, this is what Maimonides said, if you were brought up by non-observant parents in a non-observant environment, you're not to be blamed for being non-observant because you're anus. Anus is kind of compelled or forced to be non-observer didn't know the law. If you don't know the law, you're not responsible. And the one who adopted this ruling with relation to the modern non-observant Jews was Rabbi Jacob Ettlinger of Germany, who said the same about the Reform and other non-observant Jews. If they are brought up in a place or in a family where this is taken as kind of normative Judaism, we can't blame them for that, and therefore we shouldn't treat them, of course, not treat them as goyim, as non-Jews, and accept that as usual. Hazon Ish says a very similar thing, but in a much more sweeping way and with much more interesting justification. He comes to the question from another angle. His angle is the din moridin. Moridin is a law appearing in the Talmud as well, according to which the non-observant, not all the non-observant, but the rebellious Jews, Epikosim, Mechalei Shabbat Befarhesia, and the like, desecrators of Sabbath in public and the like, should be actually it's not only allowed but even recommended to kill them without a trial. This law, which appears in the Talmud, is called Moridin. As we all know, it was not it was quite a dead letter within the Talmudic text. They didn't use it ever in halachic practice, and different rabbis coped with it in a different way. And when the Hazon Ish comes to this law of Moridin, it's called casting in. It's not that you kill them with your hands, but you have to cast them into the pit and not help them go up. It's a kind of indirect way to kill them. When the Hazon Ish goes to this sugya, he really has a conflict, internal halachic, not a kind of moral conflict. His conflict is how come that the halacha, that is so strict about inflicting death penalty and has so many conditions to convict a person in a transgression that requires that death penalty, and is so miserly about inflicting that death penalty. Here it becomes so lenient about letting the person's blood and killing him without a trial even. So he makes all the interpretive efforts to diminish it, and at the end of the discussion, toward the end of the discussion, he gives this very surprising text that is not only about this specific law, but about the entire phenomenon of non-observance in the modern era. He says, it appears that the law of casting in, as I said, Moridin, casting in non-observant Jews into a pit, prevails only at the time when God's providence is perceivable, such as in the time that miracles were common and the heavenly voice was used, and the righteous of the generations were under God's direct divine providence visible to all. The deniers then were particularly perverse, as their evil inclination pulled them toward desires and lawlessness. And then the destruction of the evildoers was offense should be legal, which means a legal precaution taken by the rabbis for the world to make everyone know that inciting the people to sin brought forth suffering, plagues, war, and hunger. It was an extraordinary a sanction only because of the problems of that generation to kill them on the spot. But in the time of divine concealment, this is how he characterizes the modern time. The time of divine concealment, where faith has been cut off from the spiritual impoverished, once again, the same term once, the law of casting in qualifies not as mending offense against the breach, but rather as enlarging the breach, because it will appear to them as an act of destruction and violence, God forbid. And since our entire purpose is to rectify the community, the law does not apply at a time when it is not imperative, and we must instead return them to belief by ropes of love and bring them under the ray of light as far as we can. Now, what he does here is halachically brilliant, because he says, in the older times, we say that if someone is in concealment, so to speak, because he didn't know that this is the Torah, he didn't know how severe it is to disobey the Torah and the like, and therefore exempted him from responsibility for his sins, today we're all in concealment. It's not a matter of where you were brought up, or who are your parents, or who was your environment. The entire world is in concealment. We don't see God's providence. So we're all kind of anusim, we're all kind of compelled to be sinful because we don't have the necessary knowledge to be responsible for our sins. So in that respect, what other rabbis took as a personal condition of the non-observant in some cases, he took it as an overall universal condition of all of us that live in concealment of God's providence. And therefore, they're all exempt, and we should take them as, according to the Halachic category, captivated children, captivated infants, like as if they were captivated in their early childhood and were brought up in non-Jewish environments. Another famous, this is once again, it doesn't come, maybe you can say that the kind of moral, ethical, humanistic considerations went in, but the Hazon Ish doesn't like to speak as if some humanistic reasons come here. He wants to be as attached as possible to the text. So for him, the problem is not the conflict between Torah and morals. It's not that Torah and morality. It's a conflict within Torah itself. And therefore he says the entire decree of the entire law of Moridin, of casting in, was a temporary law. He makes a temporary law, and it worked. It was prevailed as long as it worked. And since it doesn't work anymore, it's not effective. It's obsolete. So it is no longer in action. The same attitude that led him here to this, so to speak, tolerant approach to the non-observant made him also very suspicious toward the initiatives to enact a day of commemoration of the Holocaust. Now, we know about Yom HaShoah, but in the beginning, after the war, there are other proposals as well. There was a suggestion, for example, to have a fast day on one of the days that are to be determined. Or another option was that, and the Hazon Ish opposed that, because he said we don't have an authority to enact new Halakhah. Another suggestion was that there would be a universal Shiva. All the Jews will sit Shiva for 7 days and mourn not as a permanent enactment, but rather as a one-time initiative, symbolically to sit Shiva on the entire on all the victims of the Holocaust. The Hazon Ish was very, very much against all those initiatives. And when they wrote to him and actually expressed the desire of the public to express their agony in some halachic way, he dismissed that altogether. And one of his letters is really, once again, very principled. He writes, and I'll read it out loud. He says, matters of halacha are based on the Torah, whose foundations are in the written Torah and are explicated by the oral Torah. And even a prophet may not enact new law unless a source for it is found in Torah. Just as detracting from the law is a deviation from the Torah, so as well is adding to its commandments. Based on this principle, a person who wants to mourn his murdered relatives must ask a rabbi whether he is obligated to commence 7 days of mourning for the horrific suffering that we underwent or not. In cases when we are obligated, we don't need official decisions. If we're exempt, we're obligated to follow that exemption, for it is the Torah that exempted us. And obeying is better than sacrifice. Obeying the exemption in this case is better than sacrifice, and we'll quote the full context in a minute. And the suggestion to convene and decide and make new law and enact and enforce a worldwide Shiva to commemorate the Shoah is an act of disrespect, God forbid, of the fundamentals of the Halakhah, and should be removed from discussion before it was raised. Similarly, establishing a permanent fast day is within the category of rabbinic command. We actually enact a new rabbinic commandment. What we currently have as practiced fast days are from the time when there was still prophecy. How can we, a generation that is best silent, dare think like this to establish laws for future generations? This suggestion implies the denial of our sins and our lowliness, while we are dirtied with our transgressions and iniquities, impoverished and empty of Torah learning, and naked of the observance of the commandments. Let us not be presumptuous. Rather, let us investigate our ways and repent. This is our obligation, as it is says, is not this the fast that I've chosen, etc. And he implies here, he alludes here to the text in Yeshayahu, in Isaiah. Is it such a fast that I have chosen, a day for a man to afflict his soul? Is it to deal thy bread to the hungry, and that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house? When thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, and that thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh? Is this not what I do certainly prefer, God says? And he actually says that this is what what we should do if we want really to express our agony, express our wish to commemorate the deceased. In that principled language, he actually says there is no room for any new enactment, not to cool, not to the more lenient side, not to the more stringent side, not to make new obligations, not to take out any obligations. We're not authorized to do that in any case. And even though people here want to express their agony, the Halakhah is not the medium to express people's agony. And if there is some personal agony, let the person go to the rabbi said and ask about himself. If he or she is obligated to more or not. But in the national level, is enacting a new halakhah. No enactment of new halakhah is legitimate in the eyes of the Hazon Ish. And it should be, I must mention, it's really, in his opinion, any such thing is an introduction to reform, and in even other aspects which I don't have the time to elaborate here, he took the same line of really strictly opposing and staunchly opposing any initiative of legislation of new halakhah. The question that took the most of the Hazon Ish's attention in his recent years, the subject that most bothered him, was the draft and then later the national service. The government of Israel decided already in 1948 that will be a universal draft for men and women alike, and that everyone at the age of 18 will be mobilized to the army. As soon as the Ben Gurion spoke about that, all the rabbis were against mobilizing, recruiting the girls, the women, for many halachic reasons. Most of them is a danger to their modesty, but also the fact that they are not allowed to carry a gun according to the halakha, and they're supposed to be under their parents or under their husbands and not under any other authority. This is what most of the rabbis said, and the opposition was universal by all the rabbis, whether Haredi or Zionist religious. Rabbi Herzog, Rabbi Uziel were very Zionist, in their worldview, did not accept that either, and they're in one front with all the Haredi rabbis against that. And then Ben Gurion was impressed by this consensus and decided, okay, so only men. As we know, he did exempt a few hundreds of bocherim, yeshiva students, what later became more and more enlarged, the exemption. But with regard to women, he was more flexible and decided instead of army, they should go to national service. There they could be sent to religious settlements and be under authority of religious educators, and that can be a solution that the rabbis can accept. Here, the rabbis split. The religious rabbis, the religious Zionist religious rabbis, didn't really express their consent, but actually they did agree to that with silence. While the Haredi rabbis, the non-Zionist rabbis, oppose it very, very vehemently. They believe that it's all the same thing in different dress, and it's a kind of maneuver manipulating the rabbis, sending the young women to military service where they should be checked by male doctors and be with male partners in the camps under male commanders. It's only one and the same and just calling it a different name, and they opposed that as well. Hazon Ish was very, very fearful about this possibility, wrote many letters to other rabbis, to Rabbi Herzog, to members of the Knesset, to whoever can have some influence against what he called this evil decree, and even demanded that the Haredi parties will not join the coalition if this law will passes. And actually, they obeyed him, and all the time told Ben Gurion, Hazon Ish says this, Hazon Ish said that, and this is what actually evoked Ben Gurion's curiosity. Both him and the Briskerov were the main Haredi leaders, and he asked her to meet with one of them, and the Briskerov refused, and Hazon Ish agreed, and here came the famous meeting in October 1952. But before that, the Hazon Ish made a very interesting ruling regarding this question. He wrote a letter to one of the Knesset members of the religious Zionist Knesset members, Shapira, Moshe Chaim Shapira, where he told him that his opinion is not only that the woman should not be drafted to the army, but also if there is a law that forces them to be drafted, to not even national service, neither army nor national service, if the law is enforced on them and makes them go to and forces them to go to the army, they should resist it in any possible way, even to death, even up to death. Why? Because the Hazon Ish, he made a very strange formulation here. We'll see that. Believe that it's a Gzerat Shmad. Gzerat Shmad is an evil decree that is aimed at causing a Jew to disobey the Torah, and in that case, it's Yareg Uval Yavor. One should be killed and not transgress. And he writes to Shapira as following: it is known that there exist, against the prevalent cultural current, modest young women under the ethos of their parents, who are a holy seed, glaring as the sky. Their fathers are in constant enjoyment from the splendor of purity of their offspring, who have neither taste nor flavor of sin. The damage to their daughters in forcing them to join the army, this is still about the army before the national service proposal was put up, the damage to their daughters in forcing them to join the army in any possible way would, in the present situation, cause unparalleled heartbreak for both fathers and daughters, on the one hand, and truly endanger the entire path of purity and sanctity of our precious students, precious female students, he meant, who remain for us as a remnant. The feeling of my soul, look at this. You can only understand that according to what I said before. The feeling of a Torah, of a Talmid Chocham's soul, is not just a subjective feeling. The feeling is where he internalized the spirit of the Torah. It expresses itself in feeling, the special feeling of Torah intuition. The feeling of my soul rules that it is a matter of Yareg Uval Yavor, die rather than transgress. And maybe this is also true from pure halachic point of view. First of all, the feeling of my soul, and then also maybe from a halachic point of view. Therefore, I'm turning to your honor, may he live, and to your precious peers, may they live, who have the capacity to invalidate this agreement with Ben-Gurion and to touch and not to touch the modest young women. Writing with brokenheartedness and awaiting salvations, always seeking your well-being with love, Avraham Yeshayahu Karelitz. So here too, we see that the Hazon Ish sees any attempt to violate the sanctity of the Haredi camp with non-religious considerations, non-religious values, and anything that interferes within as kind of danger, not only spiritual danger, but also kind of, in this case, also of having to do with the woman's dignity, personal dignity, not only in halachic terms of desecrating their purity, desecrating their modesty. The Hazon Ish met with Ben-Gurion on that question in October 1952, but because of the entire debate at all the time during the first years of the state of Israel, all the time there were problems on the basis of religion and state, and Ben-Gurion, that's why I wanted to meet with the Hazon Ish. But this meeting, quite surprisingly, they didn't discuss the question of the national service for girls. They only discussed the principled question of how observant and non-observant Jews can live together in a secular state without really, as it was phrased by, according to one of the only witness that stood there, without exploding from within, without Havas exploding from within. This meeting was later on became symbolic. The chief of state and the main, the most prominent rabbi of the generation, the power of the state versus the power of the spirit coming together, but actually it bore no fruit. It didn't have any practical fruit, except for the fact that Ben-Gurion became quite impressed by the Hazon Ish, and to some degree even liked him. And when the Hazon Ish passed away, he eulogized him in the government cabinet meeting that followed. And when he received the Hazon Ish's small book on trust and faith and Emunah Bitachon, he recommended that it be taught in schools throughout the country. But basically, the Hazon Ish, as I said, was not only the main Torah and the Hazon Ish later on wrote to him that he wants him to abolish this evil decree, as he called it, and Ben-Gurion answered him, a law of a sovereign people of Israel in its land is not an evil decree. Yes, it's a term usually used for the Goyim's anti-Semitic laws. It's not an evil decree, and he, of course, refused. And this way, I believe that the Hazon Ish combined together only in the last year of his life both halachic authority and the kind of political and ideological leadership, which both he assumed as a person who really was the right man in the right place in the right time for really preaching the values of the Haredi community. Then, in a quite outstanding way, most of the Haredi were much more moderate, much more pro-Zionist in his time. But later on, the more the Haredi society developed, he became a kind of symbolic figure for really a true ideological, pure worldview, Haredi worldview that should be a paragon for future generations. So to sum it up, the Hazon Ish's method of Pesak was, if we focus on that, is similar to that of the Rishonim. He's also based mainly on Rishonim. He almost doesn't read the Achronim, the later authorities. He's based on really practical aspects of the Pesak. He wants to neutralize the interpretation from anything that is not pure text. He wants to understand the text not only by the plain meaning of the words, but also from the entire broad perspective that he has on the entire Talmudic text. This understanding of the text is not only by understanding of the word, but also a kind of internalizing the spirit of the text, which is only a merit of Talmidei Chachamim. Not everyone can do that. And he really expresses an elitist view of the halachic authority based on the fact that only real Torah scholars can really understand what the Torah wants from you and don't involve non-halachic considerations, and therefore it's for them and not for the people to decide what the law is. This is just in really a nutshell some characteristics, some patterns of the Hazon Ish's method of Pesak. So I took a little more time than I planned, but I believe that the picture now is fuller. I hope it's okay with you.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown. If with your permission, if we could take just a couple of questions, those who have to leave, of course, feel free, but this was such a rich lecture. I'm sure people might have a couple of questions for you. Is that okay?
Sure.
Great. Over to you guys. You can just unmute and speak.
Thank you very much. That was informative. If you ask a person, like, what do you call someone who completely reinterprets halacha and turns it on its head? A lot of people say a reform rabbi. But if the Hazon Ish, in scores, if not hundreds of times, does a complete reinterpretation. And I'm not trying to call him a reform rabbi, but how does one make that line between reinterpretation, which is reform with a capital R, and the Hazon Ish, which we say reform with a lowercase r?
It's a good question, and the Hazon Ish would answer you that a Torah scholar should be loyal to the truth of his own understanding, and first of all, it's he who faces the text and hence has to be loyal to his truth. The difference between reform movement and an unconventional or irregular understanding of the text, the Hazon Ish will answer, is the question of how much you really direct yourself to the core of the text itself without having other values and other ideologies or other considerations whatsoever interfere in your analysis. If it's in order to adapt the Torah to the time, to certain ideologies, to certain moral values or the like, it's actually distorting the Halakhah. If you're loyal to a truth which is based on really reading the text thoroughly as it is, you're faithful to Halakhah. And even I don't believe that the Hazon Ish would say that this is a criterion, but we as bystanders can say that the fact that most of the halachic rulings of the Hazon Ish, such as the Shur and such as the Shemitah, such as the milking on Shabbat and other things that we didn't mention here, so even the case of the Dateland to some degree, is to the Chumrah, is to the stringent direction, means that it doesn't want, maybe he has other considerations interfering here to the stringent direction, but it doesn't want to satisfy anyone. He doesn't want to adapt the Halakhah to anything. He wants to get the truth as it is from his reading. And that's what takes him out from, or makes him it takes him out of the possibility of being considered reform or reformist to some degree.
Somebody sent a question in the chat before and had to leave and asked me if I would ask you the question. I'm going to reframe her question a little bit. She wanted to ask about the Shemitah ruling, and in particular, given the kind of extreme economic hardship, what was the Hazon Ish? I know that he was very makil in very specific situations, but what was his plan overall for how the agricultural industry and the livelihood and well-being of the people involved in agriculture could sustain themselves within the rubric of Shemitah?
Of the Haredim? Of the Shemitah. Refer to the Shemitah.
Shemitah, yes.
Yes. So he believed that he had a few solutions. He believed that if he allows them to keep Shemitah according to more lenient rules, and also he did agree to have the solution of Otzar Beit Din, which is a little different, but it's not like Heter Mechira, and it decreases the income of the farmers, but still enables to do that. He was for the Otzar Beit Din. He was also for some keeping of the works of what he considers possible to keep the land working to some degree. And for those who didn't have any work at all, he recommended to go to other vocations for 1 year, such as he called it a year of building the country, to go to be builders for 1 year or things like that, rather than agriculture. So.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question.
Dr. Brown, how do you reconcile the beauty and poetry of Sefer Emunah B'tachon and a hardline Piskei Halakhah? Reading Emunah B'tachon, you would have thought that written by Rav Kook rather than Hazon Ish.
Yes, Hazon Ish had a special style, I agree with you, quite different from that of Rav Kook, but I understand why you think they're similar. The point is that the Hazon Ish was exposed in his early years to some Haskalah literature. I believe even more so in Vilna, where it was the center of Jewish life, of all the streams and all the movements. He read popular books on science and things like that, but he probably read more than that. And I think it's not, for him, it's not a matter of, he wouldn't consider himself as a hardliner. He would consider himself as really focusing on the text as it is, and not letting anything taking after the halachic truth. And therefore you can see something romantic and poetic even in this endeavor to reach the halachic truth. His chidushim, his halachic chidushim, are also written in a very special language, not that flowery language of Emunah B'tachon, but still not a typical rabbinic style, because he really absorbed from a few sources and integrated this into his own specific style. He was, to some degree, a kind of, even this worldview, this theology which I mentioned before of internalizing the spirit of the Torah, is not, a formalistic kind of theology. It's almost romantic to some degree, because this is how he moved. He was a kind of lover of the Torah, even in a kind of romantic sense to some degree, and therefore it's not absolutely far off from one another, his two tendencies in Halakhah and in theological writing.
Professor Brown, I have a question from the chat here, if that's okay with you. Why did he consider his generation one that is best silent?
Mm-hmm. He was a very great proponent of the doctrine of Yeredas Aderes, the decline of the generations. In contrast to the modern philosophy of progress, he had an opposite philosophy of decline of generations, of getting worse and worse as time passes. And therefore, he saw his time when the secularity and non-observance became even more widespread than ever, in which foreign ideologies were sweeping the people of Israel, both Zionism, socialism, other isms, and even those who were loyal to the Torah were, according to his elitist view, were very few of them were really Torah scholars. He really believed, he really was a proponent of the Litvish, of the old Litvish concept of Talmidei Chachomim as the elite of the society. Only very few can be considered true Talmidei Chachomim, and most of them take the Halakhah, if they are at all loyal to the Halakhah, as something more kind of routinious. This is a very, very, very miserable generation compared to what he saw as past generations, in which the entire people of Israel was law-abiding, Halakhah-abiding, when there were such great scholars as we see from the books of the past, etc., etc. He always took, and this is a typical rabbinic approach, but he was a little more, I would say, a little more far-going with that approach than others. He saw always the glory of the past as really makes our generation, our time, pale and miserable, spiritually impoverished, as he called that, dalat ha'am.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
lecture and your responsiveness to people's questions. Thank you all for participating, and please join us next week and the week after for the continuation of our series. Good afternoon. Good night, Professor Brown. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My
Thank you.
pleasure. And thank you for organizing this and introducing me. Thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks again, Dr. Steinmetz and Professor Brown, for this interesting first class of this session. And thank you to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We continue our spring program tomorrow at 1 p.m. with a class on rabbinic authority and personal autonomy in the Talmud, 3 case studies with Dr. Ayelet Lisbon. We hope to see you there. In addition, we have many more classes happening right now. You can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes, or you can watch live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again for this opportunity to learn with you, Professor Brown. And thanks to everyone who attended. We hope to see you at one of our upcoming classes here at Drisha. Have a wonderful day.